You are standing in a cave 430,000 years ago, staring at a body with two deep depressions smashed into the front of its skull. There is no murder weapon, no witness, no detective leaning over the scene with a tiny flashlight. Just bone. The obvious story is that humans began killing one another when farming created land, wealth, and something worth stealing. Neat. Convenient. Also, far too late. Because this skull belonged to a human relative who lived hundreds of thousands of years before cities, kings, borders, or organized armies. The two fractures are almost identical, but they strike from different angles. That means one blow was followed by another. This was probably not an accident. Someone appears to have hit this individual twice with the same object, and either blow may have been fatal. So the real mystery is not when humans invented murder. We may never know that. The deeper question is why a species built for cooperation also became capable of deliberate killing. The answer leads from bruised skulls and primate aggression to territory, revenge, group loyalty, and organized violence. And it begins with a very old crime scene where the only witness left was the victim's forehead. There is no date for the first human killing. Not because scientists forgot to check, because most ancient deaths left nothing we can examine. Bodies were scattered, dissolved by soil, carried away by water, or simply vanished before anyone invented the surprisingly demanding hobby of becoming a fossil. What we have is not the first killing. We have the earliest clear surviving evidence so far. Cranium 17 was found at Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain. It belonged to a human relative who lived roughly 430,000 years ago, before our species appeared. 2 blows struck the skull near the time of death. Researchers argue that deliberate interpersonal violence is the most plausible explanation. That gives us a minimum age, not a starting gun. Humans or earlier members of our lineage may have killed one another much earlier. But an act leaves archaeological evidence only if the victim's bones survive, are discovered, and preserve injuries that can be separated from accidents, animal damage, falling rocks, or thousands of years of geological abuse. Evolution did not launch Murder version 1 and leave release notes. The short answer, then, is that lethal violence is extremely old. It may have emerged from immediate fear, rage, self-defense, competition, punishment, or revenge. But even that list hides a more important distinction. A frightened individual can strike without thinking. A patient individual can choose a target, prepare a weapon, wait, and strike twice. Those are not quite the same kind of danger. There are at least 2 ways to become dangerous. The first is hot. Something threatens you, corners you, humiliates you, or hurts you, and your body reacts before your better judgment arrives. Heart rate rises, muscles tighten, attention narrows. A shove becomes a punch becomes a rock. What began as defense or anger can end in death without anyone planning that ending. Researchers often call this reactive aggression. The second kind is colder. You remember the insult. You identify the target. You choose a place, prepare a weapon, recruit help, and wait. That requires patience, self-control, prediction, and memory, the same abilities we normally praise when they are used for hunting, teaching, or not sending an angry message at 2 a.m. This is often called proactive aggression. The distinction is useful, but a skeleton cannot reveal the attacker's mental state. Bone records impact, not intention. Cranium 17 does not preserve rage, fear, jealousy, punishment, or revenge. It preserves 2 blows. Still, the difference matters, because deliberate killing does not require humans to lose control. Sometimes it requires them to maintain control long enough to make violence more effective. And tools change the calculation. Teeth and fists are dangerous, but stones, clubs, and pointed weapons extend force beyond the body. They allow a weaker attacker to injure a stronger opponent, or several people to threaten one person from a safer distance. So, human violence was never just an oversized temper tantrum. It could also be a plan. But before we decide which story fits our ancient skull, we need to dismantle a much newer explanation. That humans only became truly violent after they settled down and invented property. The neat story goes like this. Humans settled down, invented farming, accumulated food, drew boundaries around land, and suddenly had property worth killing for. And to be fair, agriculture probably did make violence easier to organize and harder to escape. Stored grain could be stolen, fields seized, and villages raided. Wealth could accumulate, leaders could command larger groups, and one argument over land could become somebody else's inheritance. But agriculture did not invent lethal violence. Cranium-17 is hundreds of thousands of years older than the first farms. Whoever struck that skull did not need a tax system, a city wall, or a warehouse full of barley. Small mobile groups could still compete over water, food, shelter, mates, status, access routes, or previous injuries that nobody had emotionally filed under resolved. The deeper problem is that prehistoric evidence is easy to misread. A skeleton with cut marks may have been butchered after death, but that does not tell us how the person died. A broken skull may record violence, an accident, falling stone, animal damage, or pressure after burial. Even a body found among weapons does not automatically identify a battle. Archaeology is less like watching security footage and more like finding 3 damaged frames from a film after the theater burned down. That is why one ancient wound is rarely enough. Researchers need location, fracture shape, healing, impact direction, and the condition of the surrounding bone. They must ask not only, was this person hurt, but when, how, and how many times. And this is where the tidy farming story finally collapses. The real evidence for ancient killing does not begin with a battlefield. It begins with a second blow. Cranium-17 did not arrive in the laboratory as a neat skull waiting to testify. It was reconstructed from 52 fragments. Most of those pieces carried the ordinary damage expected after death. Dry bone cracks, jagged edges, breaks made by sediment pressure, and hundreds of thousands of years underground. But on the left side of the forehead were 2 injuries that behaved differently. Researchers labeled them Trauma 1 and Trauma 2. Both were depressed fractures, where a concentrated blow pushed part of the skull inward. Their edges were smooth and angled. Layers of the bone had peeled away around the impacts. Those features are typical of fresh bone breaking with soft tissue present rather than a fossil snapping long after burial. There was no new bone growth around either wound, no healing. Whatever happened, the victim did not live long enough for the body to begin repairs. Then came the detail that turned damage into a crime scene. The 2 holes were nearly identical in size and outline. Each even carried a small notch in a similar position. That strongly suggests the same object produced both injuries. The weapon, unfortunately, was not preserved with a helpful label reading "used twice." But the blows were not duplicates. They entered from different angles. One impact happened, the position changed, and another followed. A fall down the cave shaft would require the skull to strike essentially the same object twice in 2 slightly different ways. A falling rock would need similar luck. Geological movement would have to produce 2 matching episodes of blunt force trauma while leaving thousands of other bones without the same pattern. Possible in the most technical sense. Plausible? Not really. The fractures were also on the frontal region, where intentional blows are more commonly found than ordinary accidental falls. Either injury may have penetrated deeply enough to be fatal. Together, they made repeated interpersonal violence the strongest explanation. But bone has limits. It cannot name the attacker. It cannot tell us whether the motive was fear, punishment, revenge, status, or something entirely lost to time. It cannot even show whether the second blow came from rage or from cold certainty. What it can preserve is sequence. Someone faced this individual. A weapon struck the forehead. Then it struck again. One skull shows that lethal violence was possible. It does not tell us how common it was. For that, we need more than a victim. We need a pattern. One skull is a tragedy. A cemetery can reveal a system. More than 400,000 years after Cranium-17, people buried their dead at Jebel Sahaba, near the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan. The cemetery dates to roughly 18,200 to 13,400 years ago. A modern reanalysis examined 61 people, adults, adolescents, and children. Jebel Sahaba was once widely described as the aftermath of a single prehistoric battle. The bones told a messier story. Researchers identified 106 previously undocumented injuries, many left by projectile weapons. Tiny stone flakes had struck bone, cut across it, or remained embedded inside it. These were not decorative objects placed with the dead. Some had entered where living tissue once surrounded the skeleton, but the most revealing wounds were not necessarily the fatal ones. Several individuals carried injuries that had healed. Their bones had repaired damage from earlier encounters. Some of those same people also had unhealed trauma from around the time they died. They had survived violence once and later faced it again. That is difficult to explain as one catastrophic battle. The burials accumulated over time. Projectiles had struck people from the front and behind. Men, women, and children were affected. The pattern fits repeated small-scale attacks more closely than one organized clash. Raids, skirmishes, or ambushes spread across years. The landscape may have added pressure. Near the end of the Pleistocene, the Nile Valley passed through severe climatic and environmental instability. Habitable zones and dependable resources could shrink or shift, forcing culturally distinct hunter-fisher-gatherer groups into closer competition. But climate is not a confession. It cannot tell us why any particular attacker released a projectile. Scarcity may raise the stakes without mechanically causing violence. Jebel Sahaba does not give us the first war. It gives us something more intimate and perhaps more disturbing. People who healed, carried the memory in their bones, and were attacked again. Which raises the next question. If killing was this dangerous for everyone involved, why keep returning to it? Killing another person was never a cheap solution. Even if you won, you could be cut, crushed, infected, or followed home by the victim's relatives. In a small community, losing one healthy adult did not just remove one body. It could mean fewer hunters, fewer caregivers, less knowledge, less food, and one more child asking why somebody had not returned. So, why take the risk? Sometimes the reason was immediate. Someone attacked you. Someone threatened your child. Two people reached for the same shelter, water source, carcass, or escape route. Reactive violence can be brutally simple. One body believes another body is about to become a problem. Other conflicts had time to grow. Status mattered. Access to partners mattered. Punishment mattered. An injury could become a grievance. A grievance could become retaliation, and retaliation could become a family tradition nobody remembered volunteering for. In a small group, every personal dispute had the potential to become a meeting of relatives with no option to mute anyone. Then, there was the group itself. People could attack to defend territory, protect seasonal resources, deter future raids, or support an ally. None of these motives required permanent armies. They only required memory, obligation, and enough cooperation to make one person's enemy everybody else's problem. But killing could easily backfire. The victim had parents, siblings, companions, and children. One death might prevent a future threat. It might also create 5 new enemies. That is why human societies did not develop only ways to harm. They also developed ways to restrain anger, negotiate, compensate, separate rivals, punish attackers, and interrupt revenge before it consumed the group. Violence was possible. Restraint was necessary. And the safest way to make violence effective was to spread the danger across several people. In other words, do not attack alone. Humans are not the only primates capable of coordinated violence. Some chimpanzee communities patrol the edges of their territory in small groups. They move quietly, assess numbers, and may attack an isolated individual from a neighboring community when the odds are heavily in their favor. This is not a panicked explosion. It is coalitionary aggression, several individuals cooperating against someone outside their group. That matters because it suggests some ingredients of organized killing are older than our species. But this is where evolutionary storytelling can become suspiciously convenient. Modern chimpanzees are not living fossils, and they are not tiny reenactors of the last common ancestor. Different chimpanzee populations show different levels of aggression. Bonobos, our other closest living relatives, organize their social lives differently again. Ecology, group structure, opportunity, and local traditions all matter. So, we cannot look at one chimpanzee patrol and declare, there. Human warfare explained. What comparative evidence can show is that the basic machinery has deep roots, recognizing group membership, forming alliances, comparing numbers, defending space, and reducing personal danger by attacking together. Humans added more. Language allowed people to discuss threats that were not currently visible. Tools extended the distance and force of attack. Stories preserved grievances after witnesses died. Social rules could turn private anger into collective punishment. A conflict no longer had to end when the original participants stopped shouting. Other primates can form coalitions. Humans can give a coalition a history, a plan, a symbol, and a reason it claims is morally necessary. And that is the crucial expansion. The dangerous part was not simply learning to fight beside allies. It was learning to convince allies that the fight belonged to them. Cooperation did not replace violence. It made violence scalable. One angry individual can injure someone. A coordinated group can watch paths, surround a target, block escape, divide roles, and reduce the danger to each participant. The same abilities that help people hunt large animals or protect children can also make one person frighteningly efficient at becoming many people's problem. This is where violence becomes social language. An attack can punish betrayal. It can warn rivals, it can defend territory, avenge a relative, restore status, or prove loyalty to the group. The physical wound is only part of the message. The rest is addressed to everyone watching. Do this, and this happens. Harm one of us, and all of us respond. Stand with us, and you are protected. Stand outside, and protection may no longer apply. A furious person is a personal crisis. A furious person with recruitment skills is an organization. But group loyalty does not automatically create violence. Humans also cooperate to stop fights, enforce peace, and restrain dangerous individuals. The problem begins when harming someone outside the group is framed as protecting everyone inside it. Language makes that transformation easier. People can name an enemy, preserve a grievance, exaggerate a threat, and pass the story to someone who never witnessed it. Symbols can mark belonging. Rituals can bind participants together. Rules can make violence feel less like personal choice and more like obligation. At that point, nobody needs to believe they are simply killing. They may believe they are defending, punishing, avenging, or preventing something worse. And that is how a survival response becomes something much larger. Not merely an act between two bodies. A duty shared by a group. The word war is tempting because it turns damaged bones into a complete story. At Nataruk, near the ancient shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, researchers uncovered the remains of people who died roughly 10,000 years ago. Several skeletons showed severe injuries, blunt force trauma to the head, fractures, and wounds consistent with stone projectiles. Some bodies appeared to have been left where they fell. The original interpretation was dramatic. A group of hunter-gatherers had been attacked and killed in an episode of intergroup violence. Possibly a massacre. Possibly evidence that organized conflict existed before farming. But the case did not remain tidy for long. Other researchers challenged parts of the reconstruction. They questioned whether every injury occurred at the time of death, whether the bodies represented one event, and whether their positions had been altered by water, sediment, or later disturbance. The original team defended its analysis. The debate continues. This does not make Nataruk useless. It makes Nataruk honest. Bones can preserve a crushed skull or a projectile wound. They cannot preserve military ranks, battle plans, political speeches, or the moment when one participant decided this counted as war. Archaeology can identify violence more confidently than it can classify the social institution behind it. A raid is not automatically a war. An ambush is not automatically a war. A massacre is not automatically a war. And war itself can mean anything from repeated attacks between small groups to campaigns organized by permanent armies. The uncomfortable truth is that humans did not need cities or states to kill outsiders. But that does not mean every prehistoric death was part of an endless ancient battlefield. The evidence is powerful. It just refuses to use our vocabulary as neatly as we would like. So, why did humans start killing their own kind? The most honest answer is that there was no single beginning and no single cause. What we know fairly well is that lethal interpersonal violence predates our species. Roughly 430,000 years ago, at least one human relative died after two deliberate-looking blows to the forehead. Much later, places such as Jebel Sahaba show that some communities experienced repeated episodes of violence involving projectiles, survivors, and attacks spread across time. What we can strongly infer is that killing grew from several overlapping pressures. Immediate fear could trigger reactive violence. Competition, status, punishment, revenge, or protection of relatives could keep a conflict alive. Planning, weapons, language, and alliances could then make violence more deliberate and more effective. What remains debated is when raids became warfare, how common lethal violence was in different prehistoric populations, and how much any single site can tell us about an entire species. And some things are simply gone. We do not know who attacked Cranium 17. We do not know whether attacker and victim were strangers, relatives, rivals, or former allies. We do not know what happened immediately before the first blow, or why a second followed. Humans did not begin killing because farming made us violent. Nor did evolution install one permanent command labeled murder. The capacity was older and less tidy. Fear, anger, memory, tools, and social loyalty combining under different conditions. Our ancestors were capable of killing. They were never required to do it. Right now, as you watch this, your body still carries the old machinery. A sudden threat can narrow your attention. An insult can raise your heart rate. Fear can make another person look more dangerous than they are. Memory can keep an injury alive long after the wound itself has closed. But that is only half the inheritance. The same brain that can remember an enemy can remember a promise. The same ability to form alliances can organize revenge or protection. Language can spread hatred, but it can also negotiate, apologize, warn, restrain, and remind people what retaliation will cost. Modern societies did not eliminate the human capacity for violence. They built systems around it: laws, courts, mediation, shared rules, and people whose job is to arrive before somebody reaches for the nearest rock. These systems fail, sometimes catastrophically, but their existence reveals something important. Restraint is also a human behavior. Return to that cave in Spain. The weapon is gone. The attacker has no name. The only witness is still a damaged forehead, waiting 430,000 years for someone with a tiny flashlight to notice what happened. That skull tells us deliberate killing is ancient. It does not tell us killing was inevitable, because the same species that learned to strike twice also learned to lower the weapon, separate rivals, protect the wounded, remember the dead, and sometimes argue long enough for anger to lose. And every time the hand lowers instead of striking, the fossil record notices nothing, which may be the most human evidence of all.